Welcome to the Bioptimizers Awesome Health Podcast. And now here's your host, Wade T. Lightheart.
Want awesome health? How about doubling your energy? With our free Awesome Health course, you can get a new video and lesson every single day for 84 straight days. The course covers everything from optimizing your digestion, nutrient intake, correct health issues, including weight, skin, energy, immune system, and so much more. The course could easily be worth $200 or $300 for, and yet it's 100% free when you go to bioptimizer.com. That's bioptimizers.com. Once you're there, just enter your name and email to get the first 3 phases of the Bioptimization report. You'll get the report immediately and begin getting your video lessons each and every day from there on in.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's Wade T. Lightheart from Bioptimizers with another edition of the Awesome Health Podcast. We're going to talk about the role of DNA in your blueprint and how you can craft the perfect health regimen. You know, there's always a question I've had is like, can you beat bad genetics? You know, like, does lifestyle, can that affect things? What about allergies and food intolerances? So many people have allergies and food intolerances. There's a genetic perspective to this that we're going to be diving into today. Plus, we have the genetic underpinnings of anxiety and depression, insights and solution. I heard recently that we're heading towards almost 20% of the population that has mental health issues. This is serious. You're going to learn some things about that today. And why your DNA might be holding back your weight loss efforts and what you might be able to do about that. And today's guest is Elwin Robinson, who is the founder of Genetic Insights. After facing severe health challenges that traditional and alternative medicine couldn't solve, Elwin turned to genetic testing, sparking a revolutionary approach to health and wellness. His company now empowers individuals by providing personalized, genetic-based health insights. Elwin's passion lies in unlocking the secrets of our DNA to improve our quality of life, making him a true pioneer in the field of genetics and rejuvenation. And he joins us from England, across the pond, to bring us his insights today. Welcome to the show, Elwin.
Thank you so much, Wade. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so let's go a little bit into your story before we get into the deep dive. So what was the condition you were suffering from? How frustrating was that? And then what led you to genetics? And then, of course, that's a very complex field. And then how did you decode that which is undecodable that was able to tweak your transformation?
Well, I'll try to do the short version. So I was very unhealthy throughout most of my teens and 20s, like a lot of people are. But in my late 20s, I already just started developing symptoms of chronic fatigue. My dad had ME and CFS, and my mother had already died of cancer. So I was kind of aware of, I need to turn this around. I need to get healthy. Otherwise, I'm probably going down a bad path. And I did. I stopped drinking alcohol, stopped smoking cigarettes, stopped using cannabis, stopped eating processed food, stopped having sugar, all of the kind of stuff that people teach, started doing fasting and detoxes, and I did Qigong and yoga and pranayama breathing practice and all kinds of stuff. And really, and I was really into health, and I ended up getting into, the business of health. I was selling herbs. I toured the world doing speaking engagements. I did retreats. I had online courses. I did like the whole gamut back then. And up to the age of 39, I was feeling great, Wade. And most people who I met would really say, even if spending a lot of time with me, that I had a diet and lifestyle that was healthier than 99% of people. I mean, I never smoked, I never drank, I never did any drugs, I never had any sugar, I was like really strict and really vigorous about all these practices and all the rest of it. But at the age of 39, I started to develop this stabbing pain at the bottom of my right rib cage. And first of all, when you have something serious, right, you go to the hospital. I did that. They couldn't find anything. I went to private medical practice. They did extensive blood tests, MRI, CT scan, endoscopy, all this kind of stuff. They could not find anything wrong. Went to a couple of other medical doctors, no one could find anything. So then I went to a bunch of alternative doctors, functional medicine, nutritionist. I remember I went to a microbiome expert. naturopath, all these kind of people. No one could find anything wrong. No one could work out what was going on with me. And in the meantime, I was learning all of this stuff, and all of it was very interesting, but none of it was helping with the actual issue. And to describe what the issue was just for a second, a lot of people have pain conditions. I think over the age of 50, half of people have, some kind of chronic pain condition. So I know this is not super unusual despite my healthy lifestyle, but this is a specific type of pain condition where painkillers did not work. So the NSAIDs were just completely ineffective and irrelevant. And usually when that's the case, what they do is they put someone on some kind of opiate. But this was an unusual kind of pain where opiates actually made the pain 10 times worse. So there was no type of painkiller that was in any way effective. And it was kind of affected by my digestive process. It wasn't that area around the liver. And so basically every time I ate pretty much anything, it got worse. So I started to lose more and more weight. I'd always been a bit underweight, tall guy, like maybe 150 pounds. But as it got worse and worse, I got down to like 120 pounds just through, because I didn't want to eat because it was so painful every time. I started to feel cold all the time. I had, massive amounts of this inexplicable, irrational anxiety that I hadn't experienced before. I wasn't able to sleep. I kept feeling like I was losing breath. I kept feeling like I was losing consciousness, like I was going to pass out in these kind of, inexplicable circumstances. And still, no one could find what was wrong with me. And, the kind of standard medical lab tests, they're all in range and they didn't know what was going on. So then I was like, okay, well, no one's finding anything. Maybe it's some kind of structural issue, right? That seems to be around the rib cages. So I went to see chiropractors and, osteopaths, PTs, physiotherapists, craniosacrotherapists, any of that kind of stuff. Again, all very interesting, and I learned a lot, and it was probably good for me, but it did not help the issue. Then I started to think, maybe this is all in my head. So then I started to go into, maybe this is an emotional issue. This is an emotional pain. So then I started to, so I see a therapist for the first time in my life, something I thought I'd never do, to try and work out, because I had a bit of a tough childhood, as many people do, and doing all kinds of other, maybe slightly less mainstream things for emotional health and emotional well-being. For instance, I was doing Joe Dispenza meditations every day for like an hour plus a day, to try and focus on healing myself, all of that kind of stuff. And even all of that stuff, as much as it was probably very good for me and very interesting, did not work. And, by this time I'd been in this journey of this pain for, about 2.5 years, and, barely able to sleep because of the pain, all the rest of it, right? Crazy. And that's why, I think the way you described it, like intense was probably the word for it. It wasn't life-threatening, although, I discovered in the end, once I realized what it was, it's something that could become life-threatening, but it wasn't, but it was just life-ruining, right? When you have this constant, sharp, stabbing pain that gets worse when you eat, it just, it's a lot, there's not a lot that you can really do in your life. Anyway, so then I come across, in my endless search, I was in a very fortunate position where I had enough money to be able to spend on all these treatments, because a lot of people are not. And I was very fortunate that I had time to be able to focus on these treatments. I built my business up to a place where I could not have to focus on it. And so I was literally learning about health, 12, 16 hours a day, trying to work out what was going on, because what else am I going to do, right? And I come across this thing that says, if you've ever had your genetics tested before, like with a service like Ancestry, you can upload that data to this service, and within a few hours, you can find all of this information out about your health. And I'd paid for so many tests by then, both with practitioners and just trying to test things on my own. And I was like, wow, I don't have to go anywhere and get my blood drawn. It's not going to be that expensive. It's going to provide a large amount of information. And here I am. It was 1 a.m. at the time. I was in bed, on my iPad reading stuff. And I can do it all from my iPad in bed, because the pain used to get worse unless I was lying down. So I was like, perfect. So I did it. And when I got the results, Wade, I was just blown away at how much it knew about me just based on this genetic information. All of these tendencies and proclivities and risks, all kinds of other stuff I hadn't, suspected it would know. It felt like going to like a psychic or a fortune teller and having them, when you're like, oh my God, how do you know this? Have you got cameras in the room? This kind of level of extreme level of accuracy, and then also helpfulness. And, long story short, the pain ended up, because you asked, being something called sphincter of Oddi dysfunction. It's a very unusual thing. in general. I think it's about 2% of the population get it, but it's out of the people who get it, only about 2% of them, I believe, are men. So no wonder no one, suspected that that's what was going on with me. And it's something, again, like IBS and all these things where they don't even know what causes it. And as far as they're concerned, the mainstream are concerned, there is no treatment for it. In fact, I've had a couple of clients since who've had it, and they had all kinds of horrific surgeries done to them that probably permanently crippled their digestive system, and they still had the pain anyway. It was like, a really bad situation. So I'm glad I didn't go down that road. But anyway, so when I saw how helpful it is for me, got my wife to do it, a few of my business partners, in fact, all my business partners, a few of my friends, a few family members, several employees. And I'd gone through like a couple of dozen people's results with them. And I was like, this is consistently so accurate and so helpful. I have other stories about how it helped people along the way and all the rest of it. And I was like, I need to bring this to the masses. This is my new mission. I've already been in this health world, but I was giving out what maybe in retrospect I realized was very like one size fits all health advice. And, through this process, I realized that pretty much there is no health advice that is universally beneficial for everyone. Pretty much. I don't want to make an extreme statement about not being extreme, but like 99.9% of health advice, it's good for some people, it's not good for other people. The only thing I can think of that's maybe good for everyone is having an air purifier, because what's bad about having pure air, or maybe a water purifier? But like, there's no food that's good for everyone. There's no supplement that's good for everyone. There's no activity that's good for everyone. Some people, they react badly to sunlight. Some people, fresh air is not good because there's allergens in it that upset them. Like there's always something with almost everything. And so the genetics for me is like a fantastic, super helpful thing to, work out that biochemical individuality with someone, and work out what is and isn't actually going to be beneficial for them. And more importantly to me, what is the weakest link? For me, I worked out there were a few weakest links that, despite my so-called healthy lifestyle that was allegedly healthier than the vast majority of people, I was still really not good in certain ways. And there were ways I don't know if I ever would have discovered if it weren't for the genetics. So yeah, I decided it's my mission to bring this thing, Genetic Insights, to other people. The service I used was great, but I worked with the company for a couple of years to create my own kind of version of it, because I felt like the two limitations were too expensive. It wasn't available to the average person. So I wanted to create something that was available for everyone pretty much to be able to afford. And the other thing is that it was a bit complicated. Like, you kind of had to have a practitioner level of understanding. And unfortunately, most of these genetic testing platforms are like that. They are pretty complicated, and you have to know a bit of biochemistry to even be able to get any value out of them. So I wanted something that was like completely understandable and helpful, even for the average person with kind of very little background knowledge. So that's in a nutshell.
Amazing. And with this genetic test, were you able to alleviate the pain?
Yes. So the sphincter of OD dysfunction, well, I'll just give an example. So there were a couple of things that led to that. One is this thing called cholestasis. So I found out I had this very high genetic risk score for cholestasis. I was on the 98th percentile. So even though it's very rare in men, I had this. So what cholestasis means, basically, it's where the bile, which is this digestive fluid created by the liver and then squeezed out by the gallbladder in response to food, especially fatty and sour food, it becomes too thick and it gets stuck. And when that happens, that's really bad news for a couple of reasons. In fact, some people who I'm friends with believe it is the root cause of most disease or all disease. They call it toxic bile theory, when the bile gets stuck, because the liver is the main thing in the body that processes the most toxic toxins. You could say the biggest detoxification organ in the body. You could say maybe it's the skin or whatever. But the point is, the really horrible toxins, the liver's got to deal with them. And it's got to do these chemical transformations to make them kind of okay-ish. And they're still not great in the final form. And then it puts them in the bile. And then from the bile, the body hopefully excretes it out. But when that bile gets stuck, you get many different problems. First problem is there's no bile to digest your food. So that then can lead to slowing of transit time, and it can lead to the proliferation of bad organisms. often referred to as, SIBO, small intestine bacterial overgrowth, or even just dysbiosis, like bad organisms growing in your large intestine as well, because you need the bile to stop that happening, and you need the bile to move things through quickly enough. But the really bad problem that I think is less focused on about this is that the toxicity, which the bile is supposed to move out of the body, gets stuck, and it starts building up in the liver more and more. And I think that's what ultimately leads to not just the obvious thing like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, but then when the liver is overloaded with toxicity and it has more than it can handle, the usual problem that happens is it starts to kick the toxicity back into the blood supply for the kind of secondary detox organ to deal with, the kidneys and then the bladder. And I believe that is the root of a lot of cardiovascular disease. Arterial plaque and the buildup of fibrin in the cardiovascular system that often ends up, killing around 50% of people, I believe is related to this issue where the liver is overloaded with toxicity. It puts the toxicity back into the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system builds up arterial plaque and fibrin on the arterial walls to protect the arterial walls from developing these micro tears, which would cause internal bleeding. But obviously that protective layer and the fibrin, which is there to heal it's like a band-aid for the damage these toxins does, builds up to the point where it can kill you. Anyway, that's not the direction my body went in. In my body, the toxins were so bad that the problem became first that it accumulated in the liver and the gallbladder, to the point that rather than burning little holes in the arteries, it was starting to create lesions, ulcers, and inflammation in the area of the liver and the gallbladder. And the liver you don't feel, but the gallbladder you do. So as I've started to alleviate that cholestasis and got the bile flowing again, and there are different signs of that's happening, this pain started to be reduced. But initially it wasn't a simple process, basically, and it's not a simple process of this. The other thing is like, well, why are you so toxic, Elwin, that you're like having this severe pain when everyone's toxic to some degree, right? It's a toxic world and all the rest of it. So this is another thing I discovered in my genetics. Despite I'd already had tests done for heavy metals in my hair, and I'd had a urinary heavy metals test done, and it didn't show any significant levels of them. So I really didn't think that was the problem, and neither did any practitioner that was working on me. But according to my genetic test, it said your body really has a problem detoxifying mercury and lead. So because of that, I decided to spring for a blood test on it, which is way more expensive and basically rarely done unless there's actually a reason for it. And especially in the case of lead, mercury is a bit more common, but lead is pretty rarely done. And then I did both of them, and the mercury was fine, despite the fact I'd had 8 mercury fillings at some point. But the lead was sky high. And when I say sky high, the normal reference range was 0 to 3. The rate at which it's like a emergency room situation is 45, according to the World Health Organization, and mine is 27. So it was getting there at the time that I tested, and this is already when the symptoms were a bit better, at like 2.5 years in, let alone what it might have been earlier. And I can only guess when all the symptoms were at their worst. And so I take this again to a mainstream doctor. I'm not averse to mainstream doctors. I'm like, could this be the cause of all my symptoms? And doctor says, yeah, because unexplained abdominal pain is one of the symptoms, along with the anxiety, the lack of ability to sleep, feeling cold all the time because it suppresses your metabolism and mitochondrial energy production, all this kind of stuff. And I said, okay, so what are we going to do about it? And he said, well, once they worked out I hadn't had any recent exposure, because the thing about lead is it stays in your bones. The half-life in your bones is 20 years. So the only thing, because my wife and I have been living together at that point for 11 years, so we tested her as well. And I said, we've been having roughly the same water, breathing the same air, eating the same food, using the same supplements, roughly, and hers was like less than 1. So I was like, so it's not recent exposure. So what I realized is, that they talk about time release, like sustained release supplements, like you take it and it releases slowly into your digestive system. I actually had a sustained release poison in the core of my body, my skeleton, which was constantly leaching poison into my blood, and it's when it's in your blood that you feel it, because the blood will affect your nervous system and your brain and all the rest of it, and impact your kidneys and your liver. And because I had this genetic tendency, my body wasn't able to deal with it and excrete it through the hair and the kidneys like it should have been doing. And because of the cholestasis, it wasn't going out through that way. So yeah, sorry, that's probably a longer answer than you're thinking, but it's just an example of, how the genetics made me think of something and test for something that no one else would have thought of. And, I would say I'm still not perfect. My levels now, last time I checked, was like 4.98, something like that. So it's still above the reference range that 98% of people are in. But I can tell you my horrific symptoms in terms of quality of life, quality of consciousness. That's the thing. Heavy metals, when they're very high, they poison your consciousness. They make you kind of crazy, like all of them in different ways. Mercury will literally turn you, kind of insane, like delusional insane. Lead tends to make you more like angry and fearful insane. There's like different types of insanity related to different, and was it copper toxicity can turn you into a psychopath, literally, something called Wilson's disease, a remorseless, conscienceless person. So it's crazy how much of an effect toxic levels of all these metals can have on you. But anyway, for me, it was it's been a massive relief to lower those levels over time. And I'm glad I did. And yeah, the medical establishment, they just said, once they ruled out recent exposure, they just said, we'll test you again in a year. No offer of help whatsoever. I had to work it out for myself.
Right. So essentially you answered the question with your own story, and that is, can you beat bad genetics? Bad's an interesting word. There are opportunities and obstacles within everyone's genetics. And this is most acknowledged perhaps in professional sports or elite Olympic athletes who have both the training and the genetics to support excellence above and beyond what's normally capable human beings. But all of us have this wide range of genetics with these opportunities. And so that's why it can be so difficult when people are trying to find out what's wrong with them or try to improve something, is because they're taking reference from someone they admire or someone they trust as an authority, and they're trying to have this one size fits all idea. Well, if I do this and this and this, I get this result, and they don't get that result and they don't know why. What they don't understand is the engineering of their own body is made up in a unique way relative to people that you can't see necessarily so much on the surface. We do have these surface things like, someone has blue eyes, or they have different pigmentation of skin, or some people are mesomorphs and some people are ectomorphs. We have these very crude and obvious examples. But when we're talking about the biochemical machinery that goes on behind that, which is infinitely complex, exciting, and interesting when you get into it, it leaves a person who's struggling to get there. And I guess before we get into some of these genetic things that you're addressing, one of the things I think is remarkable about your story is that your unwillingness to give up. How is it? Do you have a resilience gene inside your brain that counteracted? Because oftentimes I'll see these counteractive genes to what seems suboptimal. There'll be some other aspect of the genetic tree that'll be optimal to kind of balance these out in strange ways. It's like knowing how you're wired. What do you think there was something inside of you that made you capable of overcoming all this?
And now for a Bioptimizers fixed digestion tip: supercharge your protein shake. Everyone knows protein shakes are a great way to sneak in extra protein, build more muscle, even replace meals and burn more fat. The problem is the highest quality protein typically absorbs at around 40%. One way to fix this and dramatically increase how quickly and effective your protein shake digests is to add 2 to 3 capsules of masszymes into your shake. One research study showed that pre-digested protein during a meal increased muscle growth significantly. To take advantage of this, just blend the open capsules into your shake, and within 15 minutes or less, the enzymes will have begun to break down the protein into amino acids. This can make your shakes at least 2 to 3 times more potent. Some people do this and sip on their shake while lifting to provide their muscles with a steady stream of amino acids during their workout. To save 10% on masszymes, use the code SHAKE10 Shake10, that's SHAKE10 at massimes.com. That's Shake10 at massimes.com.
It's funny you use the word resilience because it's kind of changed now. I am doing better, but when I was doing a lot of interviews last year, I was telling everyone I'm very not emotionally resilient, and it's in my genes, which is true. I've been able to transcend that a little bit now, but you know, I have this genetic variant that means that my body doesn't break down stress chemicals very easily. So it's not that I necessarily get stressed more easily than someone else, say you, but what it does mean is once I'm stressed, it's really, really, really difficult for me to calm down because my body doesn't break down the stress chemicals very quickly. But it does, I think what you're pointing at, and I think it is a blessing, and I'm glad you brought it up because I think a lot of people don't realize it is a blessing. So, you know, most of what we focus on is health, but we do, you know, in our reports, we do talk about some other things. Like one example is nutrient needs. You know, we'll tell you if you need more of any of up, 60 different nutrients, every amino acid, every vitamin, every major mineral, blah, blah, blah. But one of the other things we talk about is types. So not necessarily high risk of a bad thing, but just are you this type or that type? So for instance, one of the most popular ones is the carbohydrate type, because some people are more hunter-gatherers who don't really do well with significant amounts of any carbohydrate, even complex ones. And some people do well with a large amount of carbohydrates, even the simple ones like sugar, right? There are people out there healing themselves with diabetes with like a diet of, potatoes and sugar, like that exists. So there's the whole kind of spectrum, right? Some people are healing on a keto carnivore diet, some people are healing on a fruitarian diet. So
yeah, my business partner is ketogenic and I'm a plant-based guy.
There you go, right?
And it's not intuitive, right?
Well, maybe it is, maybe you're like very complementary types genetically, right? You could be, yin and yang. So yeah, one of the other things that we do report on is personality. And so, there's a big five in kind of more conventional mainstream psychology.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson has a test for this on his site for $15.
Absolutely.
And it's really valuable insight. And 100%. Then especially if you also match it with a partner, they can actually predict where you're going to have problems inside of your communication between partners, and they can predict. The accuracy is astounding.
Well, I mean, the accuracy of that being astounding is not that impressive to me because it's really just you telling them about yourself and then putting it back to you. But what I think you will be blown away by if you try it is how accurate the genetics is on this, because you would think, the way I am, my personality is because of all this stuff in my upbringing, and this person was this way to me, and I had this role model, and I had this parenting, and all the rest of it. But it's amazing how much of a correlation there is between your actual results from a service like Jordan Peterson's that you just said, Understand Myself, I think it is, isn't it? .com, something like that, yeah. Versus our one. And it's not 100%, but it's like 80%, I would say, from my experience of going through a lot of people's. And of course, it should be 50% if it is random and inaccurate, right? So it's a very high level of accuracy. So in both Jordan Peterson's test, which I did, and in the genetics, I have a very high level of disagreeability. And I think that's really what pulled me through. It wasn't so much emotional resilience. It was more what I think that makes people give up what you were kind of envisioning is just, they're the experts, they know best. Who am I to, question them? If they say there's no cure, then I guess there's no cure. And I'm like, no, I'm not, I'm not willing to agree with that perspective, right?
I call that the FU gene.
Yeah, kind of, yeah. And the positive spin, look, agreeable people are nicer and more likable than disagreeable people. That's definitely true. But disagreeable people are more honest, right? It makes them unpopular a lot of the time because they say things that are, rude or offensive or whatever it might be. But yeah, so it's that desire of the truth, right? Whereas a lot of people, I think, they're willing to do all kinds of things, even despicable things to themselves or to other people, like the Milgram experiments demonstrated, because an authority figure or because a collective told them to. And so I think it was probably the quality of, I don't care if no one else would do this. I don't care if the experts tell me this is a waste of time, so yeah.
Wow. That's fascinating. It's a fascinating combination. So let's kind of look at allergies, food intolerance, and some of the underpinnings that lead to anxiety and depression, because there's so many people that suffer from those things and they take either over-the-counter or prescription medications to alleviate the symptoms, but never get to the root cause. And I think with genetics, you can get to the root cause. Maybe you want to touch a little bit on those points for our listeners, as these are really relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in our service, we do have reports about the obvious stuff like gluten or egg allergy or, dairy or whatever. But we also have things that a lot of people don't consider, which can be very relevant, like histamine intolerance, salicylate sensitivity, oxalate sensitivity, and a bunch of other stuff. This is, categories that a lot of people don't think of. And so I think it's very, very helpful to look at the genetics for this reason. So, for instance, when I said I was healthy throughout my 30s and I thought everything was going well the one problem I did have in my 30s is there was a bunch of foods that I couldn't eat without having some digestive discomfort. And I always thought, oh, that's just, allergies or intolerances. It's just the way it is. It's, I spent a lot of time in LA and stuff. Everyone's gluten intolerant. It's no big deal. So,
They're just intolerant, period, out here. Gluten is just the beginning.
Very true. Yeah. And then when I got the genetic test back, it goes, basically, you don't have any allergies or intolerances. All the stuff I just mentioned, even, I don't particularly have an issue with. And I was like, well, why is it that throughout all my life, there's been a bunch of foods I can't eat? And then, as I said, around the age 40, I could count on one hand the foods I could eat without having some kind of reaction. I just thought the allergies and intolerances got worse. So I was like, that's not right, because I'm always trying to falsify data as well.
Which is real science.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think a lot of people miss that piece, and I want to touch on that really quickly.
Sure.
I remember when Fauci came out during the pandemic, says, "I am the science," and I was like, or people were saying the science is settled. The science is never settled, because the process of science is not settled, because you're always trying to disprove whatever hypothesis you may have, and you're running experiments on that. And it's just the best model we have at a given time. And in order for science to be progressive, you have to continually challenge what you think that you know, because it's not a full resolution picture. And I love that you mentioned that piece, because there's so many, what I would call it, people who would say, oh, wow, the science is settled on that, or that's been debunked, or that's been proven, as a way to kind of gloss over what science is. And it's very disingenuous to the scientific process. And I credit Brett and Heather Weinstein. They have a podcast, Evolutionary Biology, Dark Horse podcast. And they really help me look at things as a trained scientific thinker, to make some observations, construct a theory, take apart that theory with more experiments, refine that, and continue that process, which has been going on since the scientific revolution. But somehow we got to the science is settled, that's proven, or that's been debunked, and that's it. It's done. It's solid. The science is it's ironic how we've lost what science actually is. So you just confirmed this. So carry on. But I just wanted to add, it's really
that's important. Great. I agree. I think the problem is they've turned science into a religion, because of, whenever when there's a lack of religion, human beings have a religious impulse, whatever you think of it, and so science has become the religion of the modern age, which is particularly terrible, because science is a method of finding truth, but it's not really a method of morality or virtue or anything else, right? As a lot of scientists have proven, it is only a method of finding truth. And if it is not even a method of finding truth, it is, a very dark, destructive force, I would say. So I'd rather live in name any major world religion theocracy than a science theocracy, which is what they're trying to push on us. So I 100% agree. But anyway, yes. So the example I was going to give about allergies and intolerances. So my wife also, obviously did this, like I said, and I'm trying to only mention people who've given me permission. I've done a handful of podcasts with people who are clients, and so I talk about them if they, But so she's done it, and she had like loads of tendencies for allergies and intolerances in her genetics. I had pretty much none. So then I was like, all right, I'm actually going to spring for tests and see what is going on. So I paid for IgG and IgE tests for both of us, very broad, several hundred different markers. Comes back. This is back when I was still 3 years ago, when I was still bothered by a lot of foods. And sure enough, In mine, it shows you have pretty much no intolerance to anything, like a little bit to one thing, sesame, which I wasn't even eating. And then with her, she had like loads of them. They were like, on a scale of 0 to 100, she had loads of hundreds. Mine was like 20 at the most or something like that. And I was like, so how is it when I eat almost anything, I feel terrible? And she seems to be able to eat everything and feel perfectly fine, like not even notice there's a problem.
Non-intuitive aspect here, right?
Exactly. What is going on? Like, again, some think, well, okay, maybe the genetics and the test results are wrong. I'm still, again, falsifying. I don't know. But then I looked into it, and it turns out that actually probably what was going on is that my immune system was responding to the toxicity in the bile, the thing that I was talking about earlier, and also was responding to the organisms, the SIBO, the overgrowth of dysbiotic bacteria. And as I started to slowly get that toxicity out and the bile became less toxic, and as I was able to get that dysbiosis under control, suddenly I didn't have a reaction to these foods anymore. And so I don't expect anyone to believe it. They can see it for themselves, but I think it's very valuable to do those tests to see if there is a genetic basis behind these symptoms that you're having. Because if you are like me and you have a bunch of them, but then you get your genetics back and it says that you don't have the good news is this: you could be fully healed. Whereas if you're a person who has a genetic tendency, for instance, with histamine intolerance or lactose intolerance or whatever, that means that there is a specific gene which controls a specific enzyme that is not creating enough of a specific thing that is necessary in order to be able to break that thing down efficiently. And so if you're in a state of optimal peak health, you might be able to eat that stuff and not really notice very much. That's probably the best you can hope for, but you're never going to be in a state where you're going to be 100% okay with that type of food in unlimited quantities. And so that's valuable information to know. So that's usually the main way. And of course, as you said, a lot of the times, you connect it to anxiety and depression there. A lot of the symptoms of allergies and intolerances are not obvious, right? So we're going to get people coming to me with all kinds of diverse issues. It's a heart failure, or it's anxiety, or whether it's can't lose weight or whatever. There's a few categories I always look in. One of them is nutrients, another one's toxins, another one's hormones, but another one is allergies and intolerances. And it's always, why are you looking at that? It's because, I explain to them, if there is something that that you have this issue with, and things like oxalate and salicylate and histamine, it's kind of, sometimes they call intolerances, but what they really are more, an intolerance is technically where your immune system tags something as if it's a threat, whereas some of the other things, it's more that your body struggles to detoxify them. So it's a little bit different, but I guess experientially it's similar. So people often lump them together. But basically, it's something that for someone else is fine, but for you is like a poison. And so if you have an issue with something, whether it's gluten or dairy, the obvious stuff, or whether it's something you would never expect, like, for instance, salicylates, because what foods are salicylates in? Just had a client with this the other day. All the healthy foods. They're high in fruits and vegetables and all the things that you're told to eat. So I get these people in, and then I get them off the fruits and the vegetables and get them onto maybe like quite a simple diet, always as a test, never making anything conclusive, but just try it for a couple of weeks, elimination, see how you feel, see how you feel when you reintroduce it. Again, scientific method. Don't take our word for anything. Like, you shouldn't take anyone else's about seeing for yourself. And a lot of the time that makes them better. It's like, and they're like, I never actually liked eating, all these different colorful fruits and vegetables, but I was doing it because I was told it was good for me, or, coconut oil or whatever. Coconut oil is great for you. It has loads of benefits, but not if you have a salicylate sensitivity, or black seed oil, cumin seed oil. There's actually in 1 teaspoon of black seed oil, which people are touting their miraculous health benefits, there's the same amount of salicylate as 1 baby aspirin. Like, it's like a super bomb of this stuff. So people don't realize that until, they see it for themselves, or green tea, chocolate, right? A lot of people describe these things as superfoods, like in the case of oxalate, sorry. But again, it is a superfood, maybe, unless it's not for you, So it's like finding out for you what is and isn't a poison to your body, rather than going between guru to guru, right? Oh, this guru says you should have all of these, foods, and this one, no, he says you should have the opposite. And, and this moderate one says, yeah, you should have, a moderate amount of fruits and vegetables and lean protein, and it sounds very moderate, but maybe that's not moderate for you, right? Maybe that's completely wrong for you, and it's your body's reacting to it like it's a poison. So
Let's talk
And
jump into weight loss because
Mhm.
I get this all the time, and you hear of different people, and you'll see it as a couple of or a group of girls will go on some diet program or group of guys, and there's always like a variance in the performers of how
Mm.
effective that is, and one person's getting ripped to the bone, the other person's losing a little bit of weight, and the other person is stuck, and and then the stuck person is often perceived as, oh, you're not disciplined, or you're cheating, or you're not doing this properly, or whatever, all these kind of character well, which may be valid, but oftentimes aren't. The person is really struggling.
Mm.
How does the genetic test help in maintaining or losing weight or maintaining an ideal body weight?
Great question. So I'd like to acknowledge something first, because there's a bit of a counter movement to this idea that genetics matter to weight at the moment, which I fully support. Because yes, it is a fact. I believe in your country, mine's not far behind. 60% of people are obese, but 100 years ago in your country, I believe it was 2%. You guys were having an average calorie count of over 3,000. You had loads of saturated fats. And you had loads of even refined sugar. I'm talking about fruits and stuff like that, but like white powder sugar you were having, and yet the obesity rate was 2%. And so if the issue is just, and exercise is like a concept that was only really invented in the 1960s in California. I mean, people did used to exert themselves, maybe for sports, and in work usually, right? We used to do more physical labor, but so there are a lot of people. Basically, what I'm saying, 100 years ago, who had a healthy metabolism, who were healthy, who were eating loads of calories, all the food you're not supposed to, and hardly anyone was obese. So there is something going on now that is obviously beyond genetics, and I just want to acknowledge that.
Sure.
However, it is also true to say that for some people, it is way more difficult to lose weight or maintain optimal weight given the current environment that we have than other people, right? So whatever we want to blame for the fact that this obesity rate has exploded in the last 100 years, maybe it's seed oils, maybe it's artificial sweeteners, maybe it's food colorings, maybe it's other stuff we probably shouldn't talk about if you're going to put this on mainstream platforms, all the rest of it, right? The point is, that's the environment that we are in and that we have been in, and yet some people, it's no problem. They if they put on weight, they can easily lose it. For some people, it's a big problem, and that's because there are a bunch of genetic factors. So there's kind of stuff that it's probably obvious to your viewers that they've already heard of. Like insulin resistance is a big thing, and some people have a significantly higher genetic tendency for insulin resistance, right? Another one they've probably heard of is cortisol, right? If you have high cortisol, then it is very difficult to lose weight. No matter how much you reduce your caloric intake, no matter how much you fast. And in fact, fasting and reducing your calorific intake can make it worse, because when you do that, you actually spike cortisol more. And so, in order to resolve the situation, then first of all, you actually have to bring the cortisol to balance. But there is other stuff. So, all the categories of what reports are in there, I've put together myself. And I've put together other things in there that people may not have thought of, like genetic tendency for high or low levels of leptin, for instance, which is the hormone that makes you feel like you've eaten enough. If you have a genetic tendency for having low levels of leptin, then it will take you more until you feel satiated. Some people do have a tendency to overeat, but there are plenty of people where that's not the issue as well. Some people have a tendency for a sweet tooth. We talked about the carbohydrates earlier, right? If you are the type of person who has more hunter-gatherer genes and your body never really adapted to carbohydrates, which was, introduced more along with agriculture, probably, tens of thousands of years ago, we believe mainstream history. But whenever it was, some people are adapted to it better, the larger amounts of carbs, and some people aren't. So that's helpful information to have. There's other stuff which I think is not focused on enough, but which is super important. The reality is that there are certain groups of people that no matter what they eat, they cannot gain weight even when they really want to, right? And these are people, we often say colloquially, these people with a fast metabolism. So it is a medical fact by mainstream medicine that if a person is hyperthyroid, if their thyroid is overactive, then they will not be able to gain weight or even keep on weight no matter how many calories they eat. And this is recorded, people having 4,000 calories, 6,000 calories, 8,000 calories, still losing weight. So that's possible. On the other side, there are people who have genuine medical hypothyroidism, which means lack of thyroid, that they are going to be overweight no matter how little they eat. This is, again, a medically recognized fact. But the thing is, as you know, one of the problems of science and medicine that we talked about earlier was this turning into religion. But another problem with me that I see is that it's so binary. When you go to a doctor and you say, oh, there's something wrong, and they say, if it's this on the test, then you're fine. And if it's this on the test, it's a severe problem. And obviously, reference ranges have to have a point. And it's like, so if your TSH is over 4.5 or whatever it is, you are hypothyroid. But if it's 4.1, you're fine. That's their perspective. And so, and they should be testing stuff other than TSH, but just as an example. So that's not how the real world works. The real world works is that there is actually a continuum or a spectrum. There are people with optimal thyroid function, metabolism, and mitochondrial health. There are people where the metabolism is a little bit quick, a little bit slow, moderately quick, moderately slow, very quick, very slow, and then seriously quick and seriously slow. And seriously is what we call hyper and hypo. But what about if your thyroid is just moderately slow or even very slow? You might have all the symptoms of low thyroid function. And, just to list them quickly, you might have digestive issues with a tendency to constipation. You might have dry skin. You might have anxiety. You might have depression. You might have low sex drive and other hormonal issues. You might have, unexplained weight gain. You might have low energy. You might be feeling cold all the time. You might have frequent and recurring chronic infections. You might have allergies and intolerances, digestive issues I already mentioned, and on blood tests, you'll tend to have high cholesterol. Those are all signs of low thyroid function. If you went into a normal mainstream medical doctor's office 100 years ago and said you have, say, 2/3 or more of those symptoms, they would say, oh, probably hypothyroid. We won't do any tests. We'll just give you a little bit of desiccated thyroid from an animal, like half a grain, something like that. And then we'll see if you feel better. If you came back and you felt no different, they say, okay, have another half. Now you're on one. And they would just keep doing that and increasing that until your symptoms went away. Then, for some reason, maybe they just made a mistake. Maybe there's a conspiracy. Let your viewers speculate on that. Around the 60s, they stopped doing that. A little bit before the 60s, depending on where you are, but definitely by the 60s, they'd stop doing that. And then suddenly, if you go to a doctor with all the same symptoms, they'll say, okay, well, for your low sex drive, we'll give you Viagra. And these days, they have a female version as well, right? For your depression, we'll give you an SSRI. For your anxiety, we'll give you Xanax. For your high cholesterol, we'll give you statins. For your unexplained weight gain, in the past, they would give amphetamines. Now they'll give you Ozempic. For your digestive problems, we'll give you antibiotics. For your stomach acid reflux, we'll give you antacids. For your allergies, we'll give you antihistamines. Like, you see what I mean? Like, it goes on. And it's like, is that a coincidence that rather than giving one simple, extremely cheap, natural, animal-based thing to kind of resolve all these issues? Anyway, I say all that because not 2%, like they say these days, but again, about 100 years ago, 40% of people would be in that category of being hypothyroid. So is one of the reasons why 100 years ago, obesity was at 2% and now it's at 60%, simply because people are not getting the treatment they need. And the theory on this, like the mainstream theory, is that people with low thyroid function are just generally weaker because there's not enough cellular mitochondrial energy. And so they used to usually die before they reached adulthood by some kind of acute infectious disease. These days, we're keeping all these people, and I'd be in this category, so I'm not dissing anyone. We keep all these people alive with antibiotics and other medical treatments. And so then they live long enough to develop all of these chronic diseases instead, the diabetes and the heart disease and maybe the ones I shouldn't mention and, all the rest of it. But it's all basically down to a lot of people have low thyroid function. So I've seen, now, it feels to me like everyone has low thyroid function because almost everyone I meet does. But of course, it's people with chronic illnesses in general who come to see people like me and probably your company as well. And therefore there's a higher incidence. There are people that are fine, but it's good to know that about your genetics, And there's all kinds of other obscure stuff. Like one that I like to talk about, for instance, And those hormones, like if you have a tendency for low progesterone, then you have a tendency to put on weight. Usually for women, especially if you have a tendency for high estrogen, you have a tendency to put on weight, especially around more the hips and thighs. If you have a tendency to put on weight more around the belly, especially, then that's more insulin. There are genetic factors that can predispose to all of those that make a significant difference, no matter how healthy your lifestyle is. You talked about, how you love to eat. One of the other things related to that is oxytocin. So I come across a lot of people who are in a similar position I was, have tried everything, but I come across a lot of high performers as well, CEOs and entrepreneurs and also health experts and gurus and stuff who just want to try the system. And one of the things I noticed, very driven people, they often, certainly not the majority, but a significant amount, have a genetic variation where they tend to have low levels of oxytocin. And so oxytocin is often known as the love hormone. And it's true that the highest levels that anyone would ever reach is usually either as a baby breastfeeding or a mother breastfeeding. So that's like this, mother and child,
super bonding chemical.
Absolutely. And so that's true. However, if you look up oxytocin in Google, you might see kind of strange results like, oh, oxytocin isn't the love hormone overall. And sometimes it makes people have more in-group preference and it makes them act more jealous and stuff like that. It doesn't necessarily guarantee you're going to be nice and loving. That's the point, if it's high. But so what I call it is oxytocin is not the loving hormone, it's the loved hormone. It's the feeling of feeling loved. It's the feeling of feeling fulfilled. And I say it that way specifically, full. And so some people with a genetic tendency for low oxytocin, they never feel full. They always have this feeling of emptiness inside. And so they're much more drawn to doing addictive behavior of all kinds. But addiction to food is usually right at the top because it does most closely, correlate, especially sweet and fatty foods, because it does most closely correlate to that feeling of being loved that they feel on some very deep, not conscious level that they didn't get enough of when they were a small child. And so knowing that about yourself, you can actually, if you go to a doctor who really understands all the stuff I talked about today and more, they'll actually give you intranasal oxytocin. The usual application for it is mothers in childbirth, but there is off-label use kind of allowed by the authorities that for people with addictive tendencies, especially to food. So it's like something, if you can just do a little intranasal beforehand, it's just a 9 amino acid peptide, oxytocin, and you might be like suddenly, oh, I think I've eaten enough. Like, and then if that's it for you. And I mean, I've only listed half a dozen, but this is where we have like 40 reports, something like that. There's a lot of different things it could be. I guess that's the point. And I've just given a few examples, but like this is where the one size fits all advice that's out there is like so unhelpful. Like, and obviously it does help a bunch of people, but there's so many things it could be, and to find out what's most likely for you is great. And I say most likely. We're not a diagnostic company. We cannot guarantee you any of these things. In the case of nutrients, for instance, if someone has an increased need for B12 or magnesium, these are things that are so harmless. I say to people, just go for it, just take it and see if you feel better. But even say if people have a genetic tendency for an increased need in iron or vitamin D, I would say go and test it first to make sure that you actually need it, because you can actually overdo it with those things too. So we're not a diagnostic company. We don't claim we'll give you all the answers. But what we do, because if you go into any practitioner, whether a medical doctor or a functional medicine or a naturopath or anything, and if they were to test for everything that it could be that's wrong with you when you have one of these generalized health conditions like so many of us have these days, like, what I listed earlier, low energy and hormonal imbalances and depression and all the rest of it. You could spend tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars to try and work out what it is, right? Is it some kind of nutritional deficiency, like almost 100 nutrients? Is it some kind of toxin? There's almost infinite toxins out there these days. Is it some kind of hormonal or neuroendocrine or neurotransmitter imbalance? That's sometimes very expensive to test, sometimes difficult. Is it some kind of lifestyle thing that requires intensive investigation? Is it some kind of chronic infection? That could be loads of different places where it is. It could be loads of different organisms. Oh my God, there's so many things that you could test if you really want to. So obviously a highly skilled practitioner should be better at knowing how to narrow that down. But especially this is, you said about the self-empowerment. if you've tried those practitioners like I did, and you haven't had the success that you wanted, this is like a way for people to take it into their own hands and like work it out for themselves if they want to.
Amazing. There's a lot of different genetic tests out there, and they vary in relevancy or understanding. I guess there's what's being used is basically an algorithm of data pulls that are leading to the correlations or what you get. So what makes your test, and you can please name the name of it, what makes it unique relative to some of the tests that are out there? And you did mention kind of the descriptiveness of what you're talking about, because I've done a bunch of genetic tests and they vary significantly in
Yes, they do.
and how deep the rabbit hole is, or how to discern that. And you usually need an expert to help you discern it. Can you run us through what makes your test and what the name of it is and how people can get it?
Yeah, thank you. So geneticinsights.co, if you'd like to see it for yourself. But let me give a guide. You don't necessarily have to get mine. Maybe you're in a country where it's more difficult. Let me just give a general guide to how to choose a genetics company, if that's okay. So the first thing to understand is this. Most of the ones out there, and unfortunately, especially most of the ones that have become, I don't know, popular, I guess none of them are mainstream yet, but the ones that become more popular, they are often extremely simplistic, and I would say to the degree of being irresponsibly simplistic. So there are basically two ways you can do it. There's the way that you kind of just hinted at there, which is great and is actually the way that we do it. But the way most companies do it could be really recreated by anyone who hires a developer for a couple of $1,000s. So you have these SNPs. So SNP stands for single nucleotide polymorphism, and it's basically like one little variation in your genetic code. And so all these different ancestry service and all the people who test genetics properly, like our company does, they'll come up with a list of millions and millions of different SNPs, and that's in a file, and that's your raw genetic data. You don't have to look at every single line of code, because a lot of it is the same between you, me, and a banana, so and between every human being, like 98% of it is the same. So we're just looking at where there's the variance, right? And we sequence the whole human genome, so we know the variants, at least, a lot of them that are important. And so a lot of these ancestry companies, especially, and some health companies, test all of them. So once you have that data, one of the things you can do with it, if you're like, as I said, a lot of these unfortunately popular companies, you can just go through it and you can go, oh, you have this one SNP. Well, that means all of these very, very important things. And because of this, you have an increased risk of this. And often they'll say you have an increased need for this. And therefore you have to buy a supplement, which luckily we sell. And often these companies will only test 5, 10, 50 maybe of these SNPs to come to all of these conclusions. Like I said, and anyone can do this, because literally all you have to do is you have to take the raw data, you build a little program that says, if this SNP exists, give this line of text and this product recommendation. What we do is way more difficult than that. And we're not the only company who does it. So again, I'm just helping people to find the company that's right for them, but it is the minority of companies that do it. So what we have is, as you said, an AI algorithm. It is created and manned full-time by several dozen full-time research scientists who all have doctorates, and it's managed full-time by several dozen AI engineers. And so the scientists, what are they doing? They're constantly looking at and updating the research, saying, okay, this SNP, what does it mean? What are the correlations with it? So our company doesn't just provide risk scores, which is one of the things I talked about. If that's all it provided, I wouldn't do this, because I would hate to just say to someone, you've got a much higher risk of having this disease. Good luck. I mean, that's a terrible thing to do to anyone, right? We don't do that. We might say you have a much higher risk of this disease, but here are specific recommendations that we know there are many scientific studies, and we provide, maybe on average 2 citations per sentence with all of these recommendations, and with everything, in fact, that we know that these things are going to be significantly helpful if you have this higher risk, to mitigate the risk, right? And so like your company, like my company, we're not allowed to say we diagnose, treat, or prevent any disease, right? But we are allowed to say we can mitigate risk, because we really can. It's like it's so much the case that we're actually allowed to say it. So we can help reduce or mitigate the risk of you having these specific issues by by giving you that information of what the evidence has shown is most likely to be helpful for you. And those recommendations will vary somewhat depending on your unique genetics. Although, some things that are really beneficial, the research will show they're beneficial universally. So our company does that. Some other companies do that. Most of them do not. Now, funnily enough, all the ones that don't, they have two strategies. What they'll either do is really simplify it and market it very well. And whenever you have people who are like, and I get a lot of these emails, unfortunately, they're like, I've heard this gene is super important. Do you test for this gene? And I'm like, well, yeah, we test for all of them. But let me disabuse you of the idea that this one gene is super important, because in fact, it's rarely as simple as that. Occasionally it is. Like, for instance, the nutrient biotin, vitamin B7, there is only one gene that we test to see if you might need more of that. So that does exist. That is a thing. But a lot of the time, say with the nutrients, we have to test 50 different genes, because you might have a bunch of different genes that make you more likely to need more, but you might have a bunch of different genes that mean that you need less. And so we have to understand all of them, weigh their relative importance and impact, compare them to each other, and then come to an overall conclusion of overall. And so that's true for a nutrient, it's true for an allergy, and it's true for a serious, very complex issue like anxiety. Like for our anxiety report, we test well over 1 million different SNPs. So well over 1 million different SNPs are evaluated to come to the conclusion of what risk you have and also what the recommendations are. And so that's why I say, when I see companies are like, you have this one gene mutation, MTHFR or COMT or whatever it might be, it's not that they're wrong, that these things are not true and that they're not relevant, but they're only one piece of a much, much bigger puzzle. And it takes a very sophisticated apparatus to actually be able to evaluate that properly. So what I'm saying is, look for a company that evaluates millions of SNPs in order to make its recommendations and risk assessments for you, not just a couple of dozen, as a lot of companies do. So that would be my guide. Now, lastly, out of those ones who do millions, there's not that many, but there is a bunch. We're not the only one. What I would look at is, how user-friendly is it for the average person, and how affordable is it? And this is, I think, like I said near the beginning, where I wanted to make our company distinguish itself as being the most user-friendly and also the most affordable. And in terms of affordability, I think we're already the most affordable, but I'm happy to extend to your viewers and listeners, as a reward for listening that far into the podcast, a 25% off coupon. So if you use the code Bioptimizers, same spelling as the podcast and the company, then you can get a further 25% off your order. And so just to explain, if you want access to everything, over 500 report, all the information I've talked about, with your coupon code, that's going to be less than $150. If you're interested in one category, so you're just interested in weight loss and all the different factors that might relate to that, or you just want to know your nutrient needs or something like that, then we have as well packages that are specifically just that, and those are even less. They're available for under $50. And so this is what I was saying about really making it available for all. Certainly, if you're just interested in one thing, like digestive health or hormonal health or mental health or something like that, where you want to make it like under $50, anyone can afford it.
Wow, that's incredible pricing. It's really affordable for most people. And when people look at affordability, if you look at the value over time of understanding these things and these nuances about yourself, again, it goes back to what we started the podcast with is, hey, how do you avoid the big catastrophic things, or at least delay them for an extended period of time? And how do you not get lost in taking advice that doesn't apply to you genetically? And it looks like you've solved a lot of those problems. Of course, the site is www.geneticinsights.co. Elwin, thanks for being on the Awesome Health Podcast today. This is awesome. And your wealth of knowledge, and it was a tremendous flurry of information, both concise and consistent. So I really loved it. Thank you for being on the podcast. I know our listeners are going to love it. But my final call out to everyone that's listening to the podcast is, you know what? Start this right now. Start taking your genetic test. Get your kids tested on this, because there's such a variance with children. We have 60% of the population that has metabolic disease right now. The life expectancy for children is going down. And yet there are a small breakaway people, a part of the population who experience better health, longer lives, better vitality, because they're using technology like genetic insights to give specifics of how you can solve the riddle of your life and live your best life. So with that, I'm Wei T. Lightheart. This is the Awesome Health Podcast. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you on the next episode.
At Bioptimizers, our mission is to fix digestion. And a cornerstone of digestion is gut flora. P3OM is our patented probiotic formula. In fact, we call it the Navy SEALs of probiotics. You see, strong proteolytic or protein digesting activity is paramount to having a healthy gut flora. And of course, P3OM provides that. The good news is, unlike weaker probiotics, P3OM survives the digestion process. What it does is it basically multiplies the good guys while protecting you against pathogens, or what some people call the bad guys. P3OM really helps to rebuild your digestion. And what that allows you to do is to maximize nutrient uptake, energy, and metabolism. To find out more of how P3OM can help you, go to www.bioptimizers.com.
Thank you for listening to the Bioptimizers Awesome Health Podcast. You can find more information at bioptimizers.com.